Thank you, Terry. And thank you to FIA for having us here for this discussion. With me is General Petraeus. We have been together in a number of dicey situations, Iraq, Afghanistan, and you have just come back from a trip to Kyiv, Paris, Brussels, and Warsaw. So we've just heard a little bit from the Ukrainian diplomatic perspective. How is the war effort going from your check-in?
Well, actually, we were also in Kyiv a few months ago for I think that was the Kyiv Security Forum. This was the Alta-European Strategy Group, but also visiting with units that I've been tracking all along, including especially the Nemesis Regiment, which is one of the premier unmanned services units. In fact, I drove their maritime drone 100 kilometers an hour. It's quite spectacular. And I actually felt better after this trip to Kyiv for some reason. The Ukrainians, I think, are in a better place relative to the U.S. and to NATO and the Western world. But I very much agree with what the ambassador just said in many, many respects, with one exception, and that is that I think that the EU and NATO have done more and more credible actions than I think he was giving credit for. Again, you noted, I was in Brussels. I met with the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, met with a number of EU officials in President von der Leyen's office, and then in the office of the foreign minister, if you will, and so forth. But my conclusion for this group, keep in mind I'm a former soldier and spy master, not a former diplomat, so this will be somewhat blunt. But my view is that President Trump rightly tried to use his personal relationship with President Putin to bring the killing to an end. He literally rolled out the red carpet, had the big meeting in Anchorage, and Putin has answered by sending the most drones and missiles into Ukraine skies on several different occasions, just keep breaking the previous records, by penetrating Poland's airspace with 19 drones, and I had a great chat with Radek Sikorski, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and other officials there, by violating, most recently, Estonia's airspace and also Romania's airspace and so forth. And what I think this tells us, when you also take into account his reiteration and Medvedev's constant reiteration of the maximalist demands that Putin wants to achieve. This is not about something that you could split the difference or anything. He wants to replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. He wants to be given more territory than Russia has actually been able to seize, despite the extraordinary, way over 1 million killed and wounded. He wants to be given the fortified cities of Donetsk, which, again, they can't even get to, much less get through. And they want to demilitarize Ukraine. None of those three can be acceptable to Ukraine, obviously, nor should they be acceptable to us.
So what I'm hearing you say is that Putin has not backed down from any of his demands.
Nor has he been willing to meet with Zelensky.
Except in Moscow.
Yeah, that would be a great location for President Zelensky. By the way, I should note that I was sanctioned by Putin in 2022. But look, I, again, need to be blunt. I don't think that there is any possibility of a ceasefire or any other agreement or even a cessation of hostilities as long as Vladimir Putin believes that he can still make gains on the ground, even at the cost of additional heavy casualties. Only when the balance shifts, and the ambassador was exactly right on this, through battlefield realities, economic pressure, and credible commitments of much additional support will Moscow see an end to the war as serving Russia's interests. Collectively, we need to do three things together: sharpen Ukraine's spear, starve Russia's war economy and punish its enablers, and lock in hard guarantees for Ukraine's future, just as, again, the ambassador recommended we should do. And let me expand quickly on this. First, change the battlefield realities. Surge layered air and missile defenses, long-range fires, and much more to Ukraine. And that includes, as the ambassador emphasized, the importance of the money that President von der Leyen has very skillfully figured out how to access. This is the frozen Russian reserves. It's roughly $250 billion equivalent in European banks. And the idea is to create some kind of Euro-clear bonds. You give those to Ukraine. It's essentially giving them money. They don't have to pay these back until Russia pays reparations to Ukraine, which is very unlikely, I think we would all agree. But giving that amount of money would enable Ukraine to produce much more than the 3.5 million drones that they're doing this year. It could be up to 5 or 6 million more of the heavy artillery pieces that Ukraine is cranking out at a level that is beyond the capacity of any of our countries, maybe all of them put together.
General Petraeus, before you go to the next point, when you say surge, I think you said air defenses. What do you mean in terms of aid that goes beyond what Ukraine is building for itself?
Well, Ukraine has shown extraordinary capacity in terms of design, manufacturing, and operation. And of course, the three of these are all partnered in a way I've never seen. Even during the surge in Iraq, where President Bush went all in, basically, on what we were doing, we didn't see that kind of productivity. So they are doing spectacular work, but there are certain capabilities they cannot build. Those are the ones that we should emphasize ourselves. It is the Patriot missile interceptors and batteries. It is some of the long range, although now Ukraine has the Flamingo cruise missile that actually goes 3,000 kilometers and has a 2,000-pound warhead. By the way, it's typical creative Ukrainian. They take old bombs from back in the Soviet era, put them on the nose of this cruise missile that they have built, cobble together the engine and so forth, and voila, you have a very, very impressive system that is going to be very difficult for the Russians to knock down. But the bottom line is focus on the capabilities that they don't have and need desperately. Additional heavy artillery is another one of those, even though they're producing very substantial amounts. And that would be the way. Also continue intelligence support. All of this, the idea is to enable Ukraine to stop the Russians cold. No more, not even incremental gains on the battlefield. Second, dramatically increase the economic pressure, choke off the oil revenues, and again, to be fair to the EU, they just did another round of sanctions. As we noted, the 19th round, and there will be no export of LNG by European, or import by European countries among those elements. By the way, the U.S., where the Congress is very strongly in favor, you have 84 out of 100 senators that support very tough sanctions on Russia. Now's the time that President Trump is very frustrated with Putin. Now is the time to get that to the White House in an agreed package and get that also out there. That would be very important. Not only choke off the oil revenues and enforce the oil price cap, but sanction the shadow fleet that delivers this oil, improve secondary sanctions on those, including, foremost among them, China, who supplies Russia's war machine, again, or by its energy. And then third, provide Ukraine with credible, ironclad guarantees. Again, the ambassador emphasized this as well. Binding commitments from Ukraine's supporters for sustained military intelligence and economic support, and establish what might be termed snap-back sanctions, although they would just be automatically imposed sanctions if Russia takes certain actions that would be essentially threats to Russia. If you do this, then we are going to do that. If you do all these three areas of action together, you change Putin's calculus from believing he can still win, even at heavy cost, to recognize that the balance is no longer in his favor. And then and only then could you get a cessation of hostilities or some kind of serious negotiations about a ceasefire. So again, lasting peace, I think, will only come when Ukraine has changed the battlefield in its favor. Russia's war economy, which, by the way, is quite fragile. When I talked to the intel chief in Ukraine this last time, he said the National Welfare Fund will run out of money next year. It's not as if Russia can go to the IMF or the World Bank and get loans or go to the world markets. That's going to be very difficult as well. And I don't think that any of the axis of these four countries that are supporting each other can come up with the kind of money that Russia needs either. When it's a war economy and its enablers under a crushing pressure, and when there are ironclad guarantees that make renewed aggression prohibitively costly, then I think you can actually hope to have at least the killing stop, even as we continue to support Ukraine's reconstruction, by which time it's going to be the military industrial capital of Europe and maybe of the world. There's no country in the world that is doing more advanced unmanned systems of all types. Maritime as well. Of course, how does a country that has no navy sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet? Aerial drones that find the ships, maritime drones that sink them. The Black Sea Fleet is now literally bottled up in a port, a Russian port, as far from Ukraine as it can be in the Black Sea, and it has no impact out there because anytime it comes out of that harbor, it's going to get attacked and those ships will be sunk.
So, General Petraeus, we hear your prescription. You famously talked George Bush into a surge in Iraq when all of his advisors were advising against it. You had pretty good success with President Obama when all of his advisors wanted to pull out of Afghanistan overnight. What I know from talking to a lot of folks in this audience in the past day want to hear from you is, as DCIA, your job was to figure out how a president received information and how to get that information into his head. How would you explain this to President Trump? If you could channel your inner President Stube.
So first, there were a number of people, not many actually, but there were other people that were certainly advising a surge. Megan O'Sullivan, the war czar at the time, deserves a great deal of credit because she was swimming upstream against almost everybody else. And certainly I did strongly advise that. I should just point out, though, the surge that mattered most was not the 30,000 extra U.S. troops. It was the surge of ideas. It was the change of strategy 180 degrees. It was enabled by those additional forces, which was crucial because we had to achieve results in the first 6 months before I went back to Congress. And indeed, our forces did just that. When it came to Afghanistan, yes, we did get the additional forces. We finally got not only the big ideas right, which took 8 years. General McChrystal deserves credit for that. Another year to get all the inputs right. I was the commander by then. Unfortunately, we didn't keep the inputs right for more than about 6 or maybe you give it credit for 18 months. That was a war that was sustainable. It was not what we wanted it to be. We did not have to withdraw. There actually is no ironclad law that says you must end endless wars if you can sustain them. And sustainability is measured in blood and treasure, your blood and treasure. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. And the cost of $25 billion for a defense budget of $850 billion was more than doable. And that was really tragic because you could see what was coming, and I actually did predict that. I said that I feared a catastrophic collapse of the Afghan security forces, and sadly that is exactly what happened. In this case...
So much of the Afghan security forces was stood up by U.S. enablers.
Yes.
They were sort of the spine that once you pull them out...
Well, it was actually Afghan enablers, but we sold them overly sophisticated helicopters that they couldn't maintain without Western... People forget, it wasn't the 2,500 U.S. troops leaving that really mattered. It was the 17,000 Western contractors that kept the helicopters flying. I'm not just talking operational readiness. I'm talking just keep them in the air.
Yeah. And
we should have continued to buy the Russian helicopters that we were buying when I was still the commander, and I fought against the Black Hawks. You don't need glass cockpits and all kinds of sophisticated airframes.
So
and
apologies as we revisit our grief over Afghanistan. But we know we have to talk about Ukraine.
They could not. Keep in mind that the whole idea in Afghanistan is that you have these 35,000 exceptionally well-trained, well-equipped, highly motivated commandos.
Yeah.
They respond to anything that happens to the much less well-trained, well-equipped police and soldiers that are protecting the urban areas and critical infrastructure. And that worked very well as long as the tactical air mobility was there. Once it goes down, the soldiers realize nothing's coming. But in this case, I think that President Bush is very close, or President Trump is very close to allowing his frustration with President Putin to lead to, first and foremost, the approval of the sanctions package that has been put together by his allies in the Senate, foremost among them Senator Lindsey Graham, who is one of what we called the three amigos, the three senators that seriously supported the surge, Senators McCain, Lieberman, and Graham, and truly had my back during the toughest of times. I think that is very conceivable. It is very important, given that it's the biggest economy in the world, and you put that together with the next biggest economic area in the world, which is the EU, and you have a very powerful set of tools that can be employed. And the EU has been doing very admirably, I think, in this regard. By the way, I was impressed. I've been impressed not just by Europe's commitment to much additional spending on defense, 3.5 and 5%, respectively, if you add in the infrastructure for the latter number, but the pace of diplomacy. I've never seen, and I was a NATO guy at a 1, 3, and 4-star, plus speechwriter for the SACEUR and a bunch of other jobs over the years. I've never seen the pace of diplomacy that we have seen in recent months, and it's very, very impressive and very, very important. The Anchorage meeting was on a Friday. Monday, all leaders of the major EU countries, including, by the way, the Finnish president, who's so impressive, and I saw him and talked to him in Kyiv this past week as well, together with President Zelensky in the White House. That's extraordinary. And it has really refurbished a damaged relationship after the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump in the White House some months back.
And yet President Trump still often defaults to the position that Russia is winning. He seems to negate the U.S. Power and influence when it comes to diplomacy or the economy. So how would you win him on stepping up?
I'm not sure I share that characterization, actually. I think he's keenly aware of what Russia is losing, which is its most important capability, young men. Again, they've lost over 500,000 that couldn't return to the battlefield. So that's killed or so seriously wounded. It's now up to 1.05 million in terms of just killed and wounded in general. So, and I think he's keenly aware of that. I think he hoped that his personal relationship could enable him to do something that no one else was able to do. I think he recognizes now that Putin has played us and that we're going to have to take much stronger action. And although we're no longer providing the direct security assistance, there's the workaround that is enabling, I just saw another increment of 500 million, I think, or whatever it is, a huge amount of U.S. assistance of those capabilities that only we have in the number necessary, and you launder it through NATO country spending or EU country spending, and that'll work as well. So again, I hope that the next action by the U.S. is the sanctions package, and I hope that there's also keen recognition of what the European countries are doing. He has succeeded where every one of his predecessors since the start of this millennium did not achieve, which is to get Europeans to spend more. Obviously, he's had a big assist from Vladimir Putin, the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War. But the combination of Putin and Trump has pushed Europeans to do what they should have been doing all along, and that is spend much more on defense and much more on infrastructure that supports the push to the east. The big challenge right now, and this is quite a role reversal. You'll recall that we had been training Ukrainian forces really since 2014, stepped it up very substantially after February 2022. But the fact is now it's the Ukrainians that should be training us. They have far more expertise, experience, and capability in counter-drone operations. I've gone through this with them. They have extraordinary, and a lot of it is very cost-effective, very ingenious.
How are they on command and control?
Brilliant. They have the best command and control system in the world. You haven't seen it probably because it's very low-key.
I've
something
heard
called ISTAR
from military experts who visit the front lines that say the different units at the front have different behaviors, don't always coordinate with each other, which is why there was a loss of territory around places like Pokrovsk.
First of all, I monitor the battlefield every single day. The Institute for the Study of War, where I'm on the board, and where you have the Petraeus Center, I echo their cut and paste what they provide, which is superb. They were with me on the delegation, the leaders of ISW, their analysts and so forth. I don't see huge gains around Pokrovsk. I mean, they've been going at this for many, many months. They have a tiny little sliver into Pokrovsk city.
And President Zelensky has just announced that they've won back a large territory there. But how about the other criticism that comes from a number of MAGA officials around Trump, that they should start recruiting earlier, younger?
Well, they
enlarge the
already
military.
reduced the conscription age by 2 years. This is a challenge for them,
Yep.
without question. But I'm very uncomfortable second guessing a country at war that has done such a magnificent job, despite being very heavily outmanned, heavily outgunned, out economied, if you will, and all the rest of this. But the fact is, right now, if you want to establish the Eastern Wall or whatever it's called for counter-drone operations, you need to be learning from Ukraine. And actually, Poland is doing just that. And again, I had very good conversations with the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, again, the senior EU officials in the president's office and the foreign minister's office and the European Defense Agency. They have a long way to go in terms of they have some reasonably good air and ballistic missile defense, but counter-drone defense is a wholly different matter. And to do it cost effectively. I mean, you really don't want to put an F-35 with a Sidewinder missile in the sky to take down a few $1,000 drone. So you need other means. The Ukrainians have pioneered these other means. Some of it is literally just heavy machine guns. I've seen this as well. They use a laser very inventively to pinpoint it in heavy machine guns that are taking out about 75% of the drones. The key is to have effectiveness at low cost. And they are doing that. They're also doing that, of course, with the production of drones. It's amazing, the fraction of the cost of the Ukrainian drones compared with others. We can't, and by the way, many of our very sophisticated systems, which we proudly saw go onto the battlefield, don't now work against the jamming and electronic warfare and counter-air defense that the Russians have established. And they are learning too, by the way. And they're sending their Shahed drones now. Some of them have jet engines. They're heavier explosive power, flying higher and making it tougher. But again, if NATO countries want to build this wall, they would be very wise to do what Poland has done already, which is to ask for help in the other direction, which is from Ukraine to NATO, on the areas where they are now the cutting edge of the world. Again, there's nothing better than what Ukraine is doing. And it's in ground robotic systems now as well. They have machine guns that are on heavy machine guns that can be remotely fired on vehicles that are remotely driven. Most of the vehicle traffic from the front to the rear and back is now driverless. It's all, again,
and some of that is key in rescuing the injured from the front line.
Absolutely.
Before I take a couple of questions from the audience, I just love to ask one more time about Putin and how you would explain, how you would brief in the Oval Office, how to understand his thinking, what's driving him?
Well, he has a distorted view of history. He's a revanchist, revisionist thinker. Look, we should have listened much more carefully when he answered that question, what was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century? Because again, there was a lot to choose from. World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, Vietnam, you name it. There are no shortage of catastrophic events. But his answer was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he has been trying to put back together the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire ever since. And I think that's really what explains his thinking, not to mention the callousness and the brutality of someone who is a former KGB officer and acts that way as the president. I had 5 combat commands as a general officer, including 3 as a 4-star. Almost every night of those commands, I was writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers. I can't comprehend the staggering casualties that they're taking on single days, much less weeks and months. And yet he seemingly is indifferent to this and certainly is not fazed by it. It is going to have a huge effect on Russia downstream because this is not quite what happened to some of the European countries during World War I, where you had every single graduate of a class of Saint-Cyr in France killed in action, or the same in the British Empire at that time. The loss is so staggering, but this is getting pretty close to it. They still have the money to recruit and then to pay the death gratuity and so forth, but that is going to get much tougher next year when the National Welfare Fund runs out of money.
May I invite just a couple of questions?
One at a time.
Charlie here and...
Just one at a time.
Yes, let's ask Charlie, and I'm just looking for, just want to see if there's anyone at the edges because we missed them yesterday.
Charlie Stonis, Pasternak, Nordic West Office. General, you mentioned we should learn from Ukraine regarding drones. Absolutely agree, and there's a serious debate in Finland about how to learn and what to do.
Yep.
Yet, and you're a prime example of changing strategies, you mentioned this, I presume we would not seek to fight Russia the way Ukraine has to, because as we've heard, Ukraine has some limitations. I mean, would we not use our long-range strike or other systems?
Sure. Yeah.
So as not to end up in a trench war system?
Yeah, but again, I think you end up in the front. By the way, the front lines are not trenches anymore. They're basically combat outposts. You have a squad of Ukrainian soldiers. Combined arms offensive operations now are not tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, air defense, combat engineers, artillery, mortars, and electronic warfare. There are now 2 or 3 Russian soldiers running from one side of the street to the next side of the street with observation drones right over them from the Russians, and with strike drones either circling or on call as well. And that's the pace at which they are advancing also. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles cannot survive on the battlefield anymore. So I don't know why we would not fight differently. Yes, we do have some capabilities that they do not have when it comes to long-range, again, missiles, cruise missiles, et cetera. Certainly we would use those. It's an open question as to how well the Russians would defend against those. My sense is that their air defenses are getting pretty frayed because they're having to stretch the impact of Ukraine's attacks on the refineries. They're way over 20% of the refineries now that have been damaged or destroyed. That is going to have an impact down the road as well if they can continue it. And again, keep in mind that you have this new Flamingo cruise missile that's about to enter the arsenal, and they're going to be making substantial numbers of those in very short order. That is a game changer. And by the way, that's sort of the equivalent of some of our air and ground launch cruise missiles that we would employ. So yes, we have F-35s. Yes, we have stealth bombers. Yes, we have some other capabilities that we probably undoubtedly would use. And would take down the air and ballistic missile defense systems with as much of this as we could so that we could then penetrate without the kind of concern, especially if it's manned systems, even if it's stealth. But beyond that, on the front lines, which again don't really resemble front lines, this is no longer the summer of 2023 where the Russians had the Surovikin line and these trenches and everything else, because again, soldiers can't survive if they're exposed at all. Keep in mind that the roads, the main supply routes, the MSRs, if you will, now have netting or over top of them and even on the sides now. And of course, you've seen, I'm sure, the videos of the crafty Ukrainians who figure out how to fly underneath this. The skill of the Ukrainians is extraordinary. By the way, they are now using, you actually have drone-on-drone operations much, much more now because, again, the most cost-effective way of knocking down a Shahed is starting to be the drones that the attack drones that the Ukrainians can employ. And it takes considerable skill. They have a battle management system. But again, you know, we have spent billions of dollars on JADC3I, which is the overall joint command control communications, ISR, et cetera, battle management system. I'd put the ISTAR system in Ukraine up against that, I think, which was made with $4 million of donated money to a nonprofit started by an American entrepreneur who went to Ukraine right after the invasion looking for some way to help. He'd already built and sold 3 or 4 companies. He got tired of skiing in Aspen, which is what he was doing at the time. And he found some engineers in a basement in Mykolaiv, and now there are about 100 or 150 of them all doing this. It is an extraordinary system. This is on top of the Delta. Everybody knows about the Delta defense platform, and it's through Delta that you get to these other systems. They have shortened the sensor to shooter, the kill chain, if you will. It's like this, and a lot of it is decentralized. But as a target pops up, they know exactly the drone unit they text message them, they go up, they launch the drone. They're also very inventive ways. one of the vulnerabilities really both sides have is that beyond 20 kilometers from what are the front lines, such as they are, which are the most lethal in history, beyond that, there is an area in which neither side has the kind of drone capability remotely that they have in again, the area right around the front line of troops.
General Petraeus, in our last 2 minutes,
Yep.
I want to do moderator's prerogative. One of the things that most dissuaded the Biden administration from providing more of the
Yes,
aid that
yep,
you are recommending
yep,
to get
Publicly.
rushed in there
Yep.
Is the fear that Putin would use a nuclear weapon.
Yep.
How do you assess the likelihood that
I think there's very little likelihood of that, and partly because I think it was made very clear by a number of individuals, both within the administration and frankly without it. That was a Sunday I went on CNN, your old channel, and said that if one of the options that President Biden would be presented was to use our power to destroy all the ships in the Black Sea and all the major targets in Ukraine. Again, with some of the systems that Charlie was talking about that really aren't available to the Ukrainians. There would be other options as well. But I think then also to hear the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi also publicly say, you should not even think about this. I think that issue is one that is not a worry now.
So it's a bluff.
In general, oh yeah, it's rattling the saber. They're trying to do anything they can to threaten those that support Ukraine. They're trying to divide European countries. They're trying to divide Europe from North America, trying to sow dissension. Again, there's a very substantial cognitive battlefield in this particular war as well, in addition to air, ground, sea, space, cyberspace, and so forth.
And you think that President Trump understands this now?
I think that his advisors understand, and I think that's actually what really matters in a sense. I don't know that President Biden actually grasped all the intricacies of this thing, although he'd obviously spent years, decades, in and around it. And to be fair, by the way, I don't vote in the United States. I don't even register. I don't support members of either party, contribute or anything, which is unique now because I can talk to members of either party without them being criticized.
It's reported that you're registered as a Republican in New Hampshire.
I'm not. I haven't voted since 2014.
Got it.
Now, you may visit my previous affiliation, but the point here is I was going to say that I thought President Biden led a very, very impressive response to the Russian invasion of 2022. I think we should have done a lot more to dissuade it, especially given the intelligence that we were laundering into information without exposing sources and methods. That was very inventive and important. But given that, we should have done a lot more to try to deter Russia than we did. And I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan undermined deterrence of Russia. But I think we then led very effectively. The problem was that the individual decisions took far too long. You knew that you had. I would go to Jake Sullivan and say, Jake, you're going to have to give F-16s. There's no alternative. Let's consider what the options are. By the way, the Swedish Gripen's a better plane for that, but there's just not many of them out there. So the F-16 is the one that will be the chosen. Let's start training pilots, maintenance crews, avionics, armaments, all the ecosystem elements required for that. But we delayed, I think 6, 9 or more months. Same with M1 tanks, which delayed the Leopard decision, the missile launch rocket system, and the rest of this. And I think that very much undermined the capabilities of Ukraine at critical moments. But this overall, is the time now. This is the time now to pour it on in those 3 areas that I mentioned, to change the dynamics on the battlefield, to crush Russia's war economy and go after its enablers, and then to provide ironclad guarantees that will warn Russia that if they do this, then we're going to do that. Then and only then, I think, will Putin realize that it is in their interest to either cease the offensive or, even better, would be to actually negotiate a ceasefire.
Well, from your mouth to Trump's ear, Slava Ukraine.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
I will